All right, welcome, folks. My name is Tommy Ferguson. I'm the Executive Director of Capital City Village. For those of you that don't know us well, Capital City Village is a local nonprofit here in Austin that works to help seniors age in place through a mix of programs, many of them social and a lot of them really engaging like this one, as well as volunteer supportive services. And we do that with local Austin seniors. We've been around for 10 years and are celebrating our 10th birthday this year. And I'd like you to, if you are interested in, please visit our calendar section for programs like this and other opportunities to connect with us at capitalcityvillage.org. So I'm going to get us started today. We are very fortunate to have another installment of our Writers series, which I termed The World into Words. And I took it from a quote that talked about what writers do, what authors do, is they really turn the world into words that makes it accessible. And basically it forms as a type of translation for readers like myself. And that really is what I think of is the best of what art can do in the craft, specifically writing, is it really makes the world into something that we can access through reading the words. So our next installment, we are very, very pleased to have Miles Harvey here with us today. He's a great writer. I've read some of his stuff. He's also a personal family friend, and we just adore him and his entire family. So without bias, I will just say, just for full disclosure, that's Miles for us. So in his life, he is a writer and a journalist. And I've got a little bio here. He's the author of 3 historical nonfiction books and the editor of 2 creative nonfiction works. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those as we go through the talk. He teaches creative writing at DePaul University in Chicago, where he is the founding editor of Big Shoulders Books and director of the DePaul Publishing Institute. So I would just like to say welcome, Miles. We are really pleased to have you with us all the way from the wilds of Michigan. And I'm going to ask you to unmute and just say hello.
Thanks, Tommy. Thanks. I'm just really excited to be with all of you today. And I want to apologize up front for any bad audio or visual. We had hoped to make it back to Chicago. I was just doing the first live event of a book that came out a year ago, and we were doing it on the place where the book took place. But we've had a few setbacks with our trip home, and so I'm really excited to be here. And having sat in on one of these events when I was visiting you guys in Austin, it's just a real exciting thing. So thanks.
Thank you. Well, we're really pleased to have you with us today. And so I wanted to just kind of go over not necessarily the details of your different works, but mainly more about the process. And, like I said, I've read some, not all of your work, but you have a couple of historical nonfictions, really, The Map of The Island of Lost Maps, which I have a few specific questions about, Painter in a Savage Land, and then a couple of, and of course, then your most recent book, which we'll talk a little bit more in depth about. And then also from the Big Shoulders books, you have The Garcia Boy, a memoir, and then the one, How Long Will I Cry? And that one, I think, was particularly moving for me. And I just want to encourage folks, if you're curious, it's fantastic. So the thing I wanted to start out asking you is just in general, because these are not sort of mainstream books. These are not mainstream characters that I can see, but I'm wondering, like, how do you stumble upon these characters? Is there something that drives you to look for certain things about certain people or activities or points in history? How does that process of going into, because they're incredibly well researched and in depth, and so how does that process, what's the seminal part of that?
Well, 2 out of my 3 books are basically about con men. So The Island of Lost Maps is about a guy who went around the country, a true story about a guy who went around the country stealing old maps out of libraries and then selling them. And he's, at the time, he was probably the most prolific map thief in American history. But, and my latest book has been about a guy named James J. Strang, who started his own kingdom in the middle of Lake Michigan in the 1850s. And I was just at the site of that kingdom on Beaver Island in northernmost Lake Michigan. But I think with both these books, Tommy, I think I'm interested in this sort of figure, these complex characters who are a little bit hard to figure out. And I probably am interested in con men figures. But with both these books, I had something else in mind. I'm just a map geek and I love maps. And so The Island of Lost Maps was an excuse to write about my own love of maps and cartographic history, and sort of use this crime at the center of it to write about the way we think about the world around us. The most recent book was about a time that's very much like ours, a very divided time, the antebellum period, which was before the American Civil War, when reality, and I think this is probably true in our time too, when reality became porous. And I think that the guy I wrote about, he was sort of a rogue Mormon preacher, and he was able to collect hundreds of people around him and to move to this island in the middle of nowhere. There's nowhere more far from anywhere than Beaver Island in the middle of Lake Michigan, and where he literally tried to create a new kingdom on American soil. And so that book enabled me to write about just how I think history is affected by changes in technology, and how that in turn affects human beings and our need for substance and reality.
Well, I'm curious, you mentioned, so you used the phrase, I believe, that our culture was sort of porous. And maybe you could elaborate on that. How would you characterize us as being, or times in our history when the culture has been porous?
Well, so in the antebellum period, it's so fascinating because this is a period of massive technological and demographic change. So you have the telegraph comes in and changes our relationship to space, right? So all of a sudden, you and I can communicate like we are now, Tommy, almost as fast as we are now. In this way, and so all of a sudden, you can be 100 miles from me and we can be talking back and forth. It was really a shocking thing for people. The photograph changes our relationship to time. We can freeze time. Suddenly we can preserve time. We can have pictures of our dead relatives on top of our, fireplaces and whatnot. But there's, and the railroads are coming in and they're changing space. And all of a sudden you have this really mobile society, right? And so for years, Americans had been set in one place, and now they're moving around. This is in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. And suddenly it's a nation of strangers, and you don't know who to trust, and you don't know what to trust. Literally, there was no US paper currency to do business with each other, Tommy. We would use banknotes, and I could give you a banknote from, the First National Bank of, Beaver Island, and you would have to just take my word for it that banknote was good. And so reality became very porous, and I think we're at an age like that now in the internet age, where reality is very porous. I mean, where we can't even agree on basic truths as a country and as fellow citizens. And so that attracted me to this man. I've always said that I think writing about Strang helped me understand my own times, but my own times also helped me understand Strang.
Interesting. I really like that too, because yeah, especially the way that you describe him, and we'll get a little bit more into that book specifically, but it seemed particularly timely given that it came out last year, and the whole kerfuffle around the election and so forth, and the presence of a strong and blusterous sort of character in the national stage. And I'll not say any more about that, but also I wanted to ask a little bit more about The Island of Lost lost maps, because when I was reading that, I was kind of amazed that this guy went so long without getting caught. And part of it was that he wasn't stealing like, amazing pieces of art, multi-million-dollar pieces of art or sculpture, or something that would be, more watched over. Right. He was going into these university or archival libraries and very delicately and surreptitiously taking out just individual pages, not books of maps or atlases and so forth, but, taking out something that was small and that some people place extremely high value on, but that most people don't place much value on at all. And that he went so long without getting caught. And I'm wondering too, if you could tie that a little bit to some of the characters in your other nonfiction books, because, and tell me if I'm really off, but to me, it was a little bit certainly with Bland and certainly with Strain, that they were kind of fringe characters, right? That saw an opportunity and optimized, like really took advantage of it in a way that, maybe the common person or average person would never occur to them to do that.
Yeah, I think both of them had pretty high IQs. I think both of these con men were very smart. But this guy, Gilbert Bland, just such a wonderful name for a nonfiction character. He was in fact bland, right? So his whole MO, Tommy, was he'd come in, he did not, as far as I know, hit the UT library, but he hit many of the other major universities in the United States and Canada, their libraries. And what he would come in is he'd come in and ask to look at an old book of atlases that might look like, and he might look like the most boring guy in the world. He was kind of, balding and really nondescript. Then he would cut out old maps. Well, to answer your question, I think we as a culture don't value the past enough. Libraries, among other things, simply don't have enough security. The analogy I always use is, Tommy, if you came in and to my library and said, yeah, I'd like to take a look at $10,000, and I handed you 10 $1,000 bills, I would count them when I returned it. But if I hand you an atlas from the 16th, 17th century, there's maps in there for $10,000, but it's almost impossible for me to know I'd have to go through every page of that atlas to find out if all those maps were there. And I also think once things are in books, sadly, they're devalued. A friend of mine who's a really bright person, and she actually works for the Art Institute of Chicago. When I was working on that book, she said, "What's the big deal? You're such an old man," provocative, but kind of not. She said, yeah, so see, he stole some old maps. And I said, all right, what if those maps were mounted on the wall of a collector and you saw that they were worth, several $1,000s a piece, and you came in and you saw that they were stolen? She said, oh yeah, I get what you're saying. And I thought, well, this is something about our culture that we devalue the book over the image. But this guy was very shrewd. He understood the value of, and he understood the internet. So he had a little map dealership in Florida. And Tommy, you might come in and ask for a map. Do you have, this Ortelius map from 1585? And he'd say, let me see if I can, I don't know, I'll have to check my stock. And then he'd call you back 2 weeks later, say, Tommy, I was able to obtain a copy for you. Well, meanwhile, he's gotten in his car and gone to a library and cut it out of a book. So he was a real tricky character, but he had a long history before he started of false identities. And I think there was some part of him that was, yeah, I don't want to say, so I don't want to psychoanalyze him, but that enjoyed the con. He had a long history of it.
So I'm curious, and I wanted to sort of draw a little bit of a thread again.
Are we there?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Uh-oh.
Okay, Miles, I can hear you, but you're kind of frozen. So.
Tommy, I think we're frozen. Uh-oh.
Oh, wait, you're kind of coming in and out.
Yeah, now I can hear you. Yeah, it just came back. Sorry.
No, 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 no,
Yeah,
that's
okay,
okay. I
all
think
right,
we're up and running. So for sort of
okay,
looking at several of these characters that you seem to focus on the books, so they're not giants of history, right? Like they're not common
right,
names, but that they were
right,
really pivotal and influential figures for their time. And again, I'm thinking more about, sort of the painter in A Savage Land,
yeah,
and I'm going to butcher his name, but Jacques Lemoyne, and then also Strang, of course, so that they're these really sort of almost larger than life characters in the time that they were, right? And had certainly a significant impact, but that
yeah. Um,
otherwise, but otherwise would have been lost to history, and maybe largely were, except that you sort of excavated their stories and dusted them off a little bit for the rest of us. Oh, Miles, we might have lost you again. Can you hear me now?
yeah, I can hear you. Yep.
Okay. So I'm just, again, I'm just trying to think like,
Uh-oh.
you're good. And
Yeah.
I wanted to tie that a little bit to, or do you have any like thoughts about how those characters, I call them characters, they're people, that had this big impactful influence in their time and their place, but it really wasn't something that we would know about otherwise, unless somebody really devoted to investigating history would be able to translate for us.
Yeah, I think you really hit on something, Tommy. Like Jacques Lemoyne de Morgue, this painter I wrote about, he's a 16th century painter. He's the first European artist in North America. So he comes over with this French colony that was in what's now Jacksonville, Florida. It was wiped out by the Spanish, who had based themselves in St. Augustine, which is why St. Augustine is the oldest city in the continental United States. But and he later went to England and fled to England and was very influential there. I mean, he was an interesting guy in his own right, but what he allowed me to do was to write about this incredible 16th century interchange between Europeans and North Americans in a way. So I was really interested in Lemoyne de Morgue, the guy, Jacques Lemoyne de Morgue, and I think I found out some cool stuff about him in old archives. It was really fun book to research. I'm a real research geek, and so that was a blast. But it also allowed me to write about this time, crucial time in our history, when Europeans are first encountering Native Americans. And what was interesting about this guy is he was unlike the Spanish, who just weren't that interested in Native Americans. The French were sort of trying to figure them out and treat them as equal partners, and not equal partners, but as partners. And but he failed to understand them. I mean, and so it was a really interesting way of looking at that period of history. And I think Strang was the same way. He gave me this way at looking at this incredible, strange, and wonderful period and dark period in American history leading up to the Civil War. I kind of saw him as a lightning rod for all the crazy enthusiasms of the mid-19th century. And so I think your question is a great one. And both of the last two books have very much been really different characters. But I think the thing about them is they're interesting of themselves, in and of themselves. But I love the fact that I'm able to write about the bigger currents of history. I just am a firm believer that we're in history, whether we feel like we are or not. I always tell my students, whatever your political stripes, pay attention, because your grandchildren will ask you about what it was like to live in 2021 through COVID, through this political upheaval we're going through, no matter which side you're on in it. These are historic times, and we're all shaped by them, whether or not we feel like we are. And I think, some of the people in your group have a much keener sense of this. My mother, was broke during the Depression, lost friends in World War II. You didn't have to tell her that history had formed her. But I think for my generation, I came of age in the 70s, we sort of got a free buy for a long time. We were just the generation right after Vietnam. And I think, but I think all of us felt in the last year with COVID, like we were living history, right?
No doubt. I mean, it is. It's like the thing that defines, certainly, and even the younger generation, and you having kids and us having kids, we know that like this is going to be a defining, this last year and a half or so is going to be sort of a defining time in their lives, and it's going to have a ripple impact effect, much further on, and certainly after we're gone. I did want to switch gears just a little bit, but sort of segue, because when we talk about, sort of in your other historical books, overlooked figures, I feel like that's also something that you pay close attention to with the other works, the Big Shoulders books. And, I admittedly, I have not read the Garcia Boy, but, How Long Will I Cry, is just really, it's really incredible. And of course, anybody familiar with Chicago, and you having grown up and lived your whole life in greater Chicago area, I mean, just the stories that come out of there, from that, again, these were overlooked people. These were overlooked stories. And what they have to say and what they can tell us are just so poignant and so personal and so touching. And I just wonder if that's something else that drew you to that task or that project.
Yeah, Tommy, that's a great question. So just to jump back and give a little context to the group, I, along with some colleagues, started a publishing entity at DePaul University called Big Shoulders Books. And it's our mission is to amplify voices that might not otherwise be heard. And we have a really weird publishing model. We give books away for free, but we also want to commodify. We think books are like, we never stand on street corners giving them away. You have to come to us and request them. Well, for instance, that book, How Long Will I Cry, we've has had a distribution of 50,000 copies worldwide already. And I think one of the reasons is it's what's called an oral history. And it was a response exactly to the violence that's really plaguing our city this year. I'm sure even in Austin, some of the incredible violence of this summer in Chicago but we wanted to find out exactly what you're talking about, Tommy. There's these headlines of, another shooting on the south side of Chicago, another someone walks into a party on the west side of Chicago with an automatic weapon and kills several people. We wanted to find out the real life impact of this stuff. So what we did is my students and I went out for 2 years and interviewed people. And we interviewed people, kids, a lot of kids in street gangs, a lot of kids on the edges of gangs, a lot of kids who were affected by it. We interviewed people who'd lost family members, daughters, sons, brothers, sisters to this violence. We interviewed cops. We interviewed emergency room nurses and doctors. We interviewed the guy or the woman who ran the morgue in Chicago. And we just really wanted to get multiple voices about this crisis, which continues to be a crisis in our city of youth violence. And the book is really popular among young people, which I think makes me really happy. I think it's a beautiful book and a disturbing book. And there are all sorts of amazing stories. But I think one of the things young people recognize is their own voices in those books. Because what we would do, it's a form called oral history. Some of the people in the group will remember Studs Terkel, that was a great practitioner of this. But what you do is, we go out and interview people, often several times. In one case, we had 100 pages of literal transcripts, and then we whittle that down to a 5-10 page narrative of their life, using their own words to tell their own stories. And that was a really fascinating process. But I think when kids read this book, they recognize their own voices and their own trauma, their own problems. And that was just a really, I don't know, that book is always going to be very special of all the things I've been associated with. It's not one I wrote, but it's got it's just such an important book to me. And the other book, The Garcia Boy, is a writer who I didn't know at all when he was living. He died young. He was a Chicago writer who was his father was Mexican American. He had come over into Texas in the early 70s, undocumented worker. His father was kind of led a rough life on the streets of Chicago. Meanwhile, the son, the writer, was raised in the suburbs of Cleveland and then went back to teach in the place that his father had sort of come of age. And he's just a beautifully gifted writer. And I thought his words would have been lost if we didn't save them. So it was a great learning experience for my students, and I'm really happy to be part of that book too.
Yeah, it sounds like really a labor of love in the truest sense.
Yeah.
Well, before we open it up for Q&A, I do want to spend a little time specifically on your latest work, just because it's so interesting, and I just have, I think, very many questions about it. But I'm going to go ahead and let folks know. So this is a book called The King of Confidence, and I'm going to let you describe it, and again, how you started the process for how you got interested in this wild character, Strang, Jay Strang, and tell us a little bit more about that. I also have, if there's time, and I won't push it if there's not, but I do have, which I think is fantastic, you have a book trailer on your website that it is cinematic in its way of presenting this larger than life character. But yeah, tell us a little bit about the book and how what sparked the interest to really dig into this guy.
Yeah, well, and sorry about the noise in here. I think the first time I heard of Strang was there's a little town about 2 hours north of Chicago, a little bit west of Chicago too, called Burlington, Wisconsin. And by coincidence, my brother-in-law grew up there. And he's the guy I really like and admire, a guy named Chris Carr, who's married to one of my wife's sisters. And I was up visiting Chris's parents with him one day, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. I don't know when it was. And we start driving around this little town of Burlington. And he starts telling me this crazy, I'm talking crazy story, Tommy, about this Mormon, we would now maybe call it a cult, that started this is a spin-off group after the murder of Joseph Smith. They start this little utopian colony in Burlington, Wisconsin. And Chris took me around to some of the houses, and he started telling me about this prophet who was in charge of this colony. And he told me the story of how the colony moved up to Beaver Island, and where they declared the prophet Strang, James J. Strang, declared himself king of earth and heaven, and it just went from there. So I was fascinated by that. And then another writer had mentioned it to me at some point too. And then, but this was just as Scott can tell you, this was just a huge stroke of luck getting this book. I got a call or email from my agent, and he said, there's an editor at Little Brown, this big publishing house, who's interested in having you do a book proposal about this guy. He said he just wanted to talk to you. So I talked to this guy. His name is Ben George, and turned out to be a really wonderful editor. But he said, have you ever heard of Strang? And I was like, I'm not sure. Have I? I don't know. And he sent me some stuff, and he said, I'd like you to do a book proposal. And, normally I would, of course, hear an editor out, but normally I would, the only other times I've had this sort of potential for this sort of opportunity has been really things that wouldn't have worked for me. Ghostwriting a corporate executive's book or something I'd be really, really bad at, Tommy, like terrible. And but this book, I instantly not only saw that it was a book that I could write, that I wanted to write, but I kind of knew how to write it. And so, as I said before, I think there were some other books about Strang, but they sort of treated him as as a footnote either to Mormon history or to Midwest history. And I just saw him as this lightning rod I just saw him as a key figure in American history, not his name itself. I mean, there's all sorts of big name people who enter into this book because they're operating at the same time as Strang, Lincoln, John Brown, et cetera, et cetera. But I just saw Strang as this kind of embodiment of a certain strain of the American personality, our history. And so I was really drawn to this book, and this book was a huge labor of love. I'm really sad to leave it behind. I can talk more about Strang. I was just, as I said, on the island, Beaver Island, and I got to say, Tommy, like those people are really interested in Strang. It was a little case of micro celebrity, it was pretty fun to be among these Strang nerds up on Beaver Island, and
more than willing to talk to you.
Yeah. It was that was my little Beatles moment there, and so but this guy, among other things, ran a pirate colony off that island, and he would send out ships that would raid places like Chicago, and they'd put these lightning assaults. So their ships would swoop in, and guys would leap out with guns and steal a bunch of stuff and take it back up to Beaver Island, or they'd send out horse thieves all over the country. And it was a really fascinating period. And we sort of laugh at this notion of a guy declaring himself king of earth and heaven. Well, the U.S. government took the threat of a quasi-independent government on U.S. soil quite seriously. President Millard Fillmore sent in the U.S. Navy's first iron-hulled warship to raid the island and bring Strang to justice. And of the many crazy things, they brought him back, they put him on trial, and he was found innocent. So
what a fantastical life.
Yeah, Fillmore left office in 1853 as one of the loser presidents. He wasn't a very distinguished president, and King Strang, the guy he tried to boot off, was still in power. So it just kind of went from there. So it was a wild story, but one that I felt had so much to say about our country and our hopes and fears.
Interesting. And for those folks, again, listening, I should read the entire title because it is called The King of Confidence, a tale of utopian dreamers, frontier schemers, true believers, false prophets, and the murder of an American monarch. So I'm curious, a couple of things, and then I want to make sure we have time for Q&A, but a couple of things. So because he really was this very strange cult of personality, and so I'm wondering, what similarities do you see about what either the context of what was going on in the country then, and this, guy that, comes in and makes these big proclamations and cultivates his own following of believers, and a network, almost a mafia style network of people that will execute, and build into what he wants to achieve, how that translates into what we're sort of susceptible to still today. And, maybe it is, I've read different things, like maybe it is like a kind of a something that demonstrates the degree of loneliness in the people of today, and in certain people and certain types that, are attracted to these cultish leaders, or just get caught up in these movements. And I'm just wondering how you see that, what we saw or what you investigated historically, and how that, still plays out today.
Yeah, I think there are times in history where, first of all, I only make two very oblique mentions to the current time in the book, because I don't want to make some facile comparison between our times and those times. And the story of Strang is plenty interesting enough. But I do think there are times in history where, for instance, Strang lived in a really divided time. This is the period leading up to the Civil War. And we live in a very divided time, and he was part of that. I mean, he was shameless con man in a lot of different ways, but he was also a heartfelt and sincere abolitionist. And so he got himself fraudulently elected to the Michigan legislature twice. But it was very interesting. When he got into the legislature, he not only distinguished himself, but he also fought hard, really hard, and it didn't benefit him for the rights of African Americans. And so, you know, there's that. But I also, as I was saying before, I think there are times when the truth just becomes porous. And I think often these are predicated by technological shifts. I mean, I think, you know, in Beaver Island, someone asked me what Strang would be doing now, because Strang was he had his own newspaper, and he was actually a really quite a gifted writer, and he was brilliant at manipulating the media. There was without getting into it, there was a thing that was a little bit like the internet with something called the newspaper exchange system. And his brilliance was realizing, I can broadcast myself to the world from Beaver Island, basically. And so I think he was a little bit ahead of his time on that. I think about this guy. I don't know if any of you guys know about this guy, Dr. Brinkley, who in the 20s and 30s, there's a great book about this guy called Charlatan by a guy named Pope Brock, or Pope Brock, I think. And Dr. Brinkley, there's no polite way to say this, made millions of dollars by sewing goat gonads into men's, scrotums. It was the little blue pill of its time. Very dangerous. A lot of men died. It did no good for anybody. But Brinkley had this radio station in Kansas with, it was, you know, I can't remember how many watts it was, but it was huge. And Brinkley, then he had a pirate station in Mexico when he was kicked out of the US. And he was able to go around mainstream media, right? In a way that Strang was able to manipulate the media. And Brinkley is remembered today as one of the great early pioneers of radio. Total fraudulent doctor. He wasn't really a doctor, but he was a brilliant manipulator. He sort of started country radio. You know, the Carter family was on his radio station. And I think we live in a time now when, you know, someone who wants to come along and manipulate media can. When I was in Beaver Island, one young man who was really perceptive said, "What would Strang be doing now?" And I thought, you know, I said he'd be doing social media. That's what he'd be doing. When this young man talked to me afterwards, he said, I thought about he might be running a Russian troll farm. and you know, this we've heard about these sort of little groups in Russia that spread fake news intentionally. And I laughed and I said, you know, Russian troll farm were the first three words that came to my mind when I asked your question, but I thought I'd answer social media just to generalize it. So I do think there are real comparisons between his time and ours, including just the way, so Strang was eventually killed by his followers. And one of the things that they were angry about was his order that all women on the island had to wear pantaloons, which are sort of like pajama pants, and which was shocking then, just shocking. And you know, people laugh about it, and it's sort of funny, but you know, I think it was very much like masks are in our time, right? That the pantaloons were pantaloons, but they were also something else. The way that masks are a political act. So Strang supporters, the men would ask their wives to wear pantaloons, and the women would wear them, either by choice or be forced to. And the opponents said, well, we're not wearing the pantaloons, and my wife won't wear the pantaloons. And eventually it led to this situation. It was much more complicated than that, of course. Just like now, when we get into arguments about mask wearing, it's much more complicated than masks. But eventually some of Strang's followers murdered him with the help of the US government, almost for sure, and the Michigan state government, almost for sure.
Wow. So he met a nefarious end.
Yes. There haven't been too many pantaloon revolutions in the history of the world, but this was one of them.
It left its mark. So I want to open it up for questions. So for those of you that want to check in and put a question to Miles, you can use the raise hand function. Down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a reactions button, and you can raise your hand that way. Or I'll scan through if you want to just wave. Just let me know, or unmute and jump in. So please go ahead. Oh, that was somebody in the cafe, I think.
No, sorry. Yes, there's some loud talking in the cafe, but on the other hand, the people in the cafe are putting up with me. So
Okay. Oh, Scott, did you want to, I know we talked earlier, did you want to check in and ask a question? You'll have to unmute. There we go.
One of the things in your forward that you changed, you have the angel of the Lord, you know, and that wasn't a part of the original book. I remember reading that, but it gives us a kind of counter narrative. And I was wondering if you could talk about the preface and the ways that that angel works in that section.
Yeah. So normally, as a nonfiction writer, I believe that nonfiction should be nonfiction. But and I think readers know that when they read that section. So it starts with this angel watching the murder of Joseph Smith, and then flying north across the Illinois prairie and up into Wisconsin to tell James Strang about it, and to anoint James Strang leader of the Mormon Church. I included that device because I wanted to get readers inside the heads of the true believers right away, Scott. You know, so these people did believe in angels. It was also a great device because it, as you know, Scott, it gave me like the drone. It gave me the helicopter to establish the setting and to describe the murder of Smith. And so Strang always claimed that an angel visited him at the moment that Smith was shot and said, "You will take over the church." This would be like, you know, a private in the U.S. Army suddenly being appointed to the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but he was able to pull that off. But I felt that device was, and it's funny because I was talking about that device last night with someone. I just felt it instantly put readers in the mindset of some of the true believers in this book. And I guess I just think a lot of the people who followed Strang followed him for good reasons. We might find them crazy, but they had their reasons and they had their needs. You know, you and I, as writers, you know, essentially characters about hopes and fears. And I thought the angel was able to manifest the hopes and fears of that era in a certain way.
And he also found his own Book of Mormon, which
I'm sorry.
He also found his own Book of Mormon.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, and speaking of that, so we
Yeah.
have a question in the chat section.
Yes.
So what has been the reaction of modern day Mormons to the book and to some of the content? Did you get any Mormon hate mail or anything?
I think, you know, so I think, you know, I'm not an expert on modern day Mormonism or even on Mormon history particularly. I've had some very warm reception from various Mormon podcasts, and the review got a pretty good book. The book got a pretty good review in the Salt Lake City newspaper. I think possibly some people, there's still a few, I don't know how many, a few hundred Strangites members. There was no other prophet, and he was kicked out of the Mormon church almost immediately. And he was only in it for a few months. And before that, he was an atheist. So I think the mainstream Mormons are interested in him as maybe as a historical figure, but they're not, they don't see him as a Mormon really. But, you know, I mean, the truth is, he was a really big rival to Brigham Young, even well into the establishment of Salt Lake. Young was worried that Strang would be named the governor of Utah. And so he was a really interesting figure. I'm not sure how people in the Strangite church, I tried to be respectful. I mean, Tommy, I'm a person of faith myself. I don't question other people's faith. And so I just got asked by another Mormon media something for an interview. I haven't felt, I saw one online comment about this is an anti-Mormon book. It's certainly not that. I don't have anything. In fact, I think the Mormons are a fascinating and important part of American history. What Brigham Young did in moving tens of thousands of people into really, when he did it, the uncharted American wilderness and establishing this city. It's incredible, and it's such a crucial part of our collective past here in this country. And so, I don't really know. I mean, there's certainly no one has called me from the church, and in fact, the church library was very cooperative with me, and they knew I was researching about Strang. So I did talk about the church's spotty record with race. I mean, spotty is not the word. The church's very slow denunciation of their own racist is a hot button word that I don't want to use, but their own policies on skin color and their own keeping women out of the hierarchy of the church. And interestingly, Strang was, I think, 130 some years ahead of the mainstream Mormon church. He appointed an African-American elder almost as soon as he started his church. And so, and I talk about that in the book. And so it's one of the many interesting things about this really complicated man. So I think I'm okay with the Mormons, but I really don't know. The reaction I've gotten has been good so far. I certainly did not mean to write, nor did I mean to write anything bad about the Strangites. I mean, I think, I don't question their faith. I mean, I do question Strang's legitimacy as a prophet sometimes, but that's here nor there. We can disagree on that.
All right, I'm going to scan really quickly. Any other questions from other folks? I can just scan really quickly. I did want to check in unless somebody hops in here. Are you at liberty to talk a little bit about sort of your project that you're, because I know writer helps a little bit, and as soon as one thing is finished, and probably even before it's finished, there's already this concept of what's going to be the next thing. So what's in the future? Well,
I don't want to talk about it, not because it's a big trade secret, and I've talked to you about it till the cows come home, Tommy, but I'm glad to bore you and Scott with it, but I have turned in a 180-page proposal, which is a lot for a nonfiction book proposal. And it's about another Midwesterner and a guy who's, if anything, has an even stranger story than Strang. But like Strang and like Jacques Lemoyne de Morgue, as you point out, Tommy, I think this guy is an embodiment of his time, which was a little bit later time. The Gilded Age, so the late 19th, early 20th century, and so I'm hopeful, but well, the book industry is not in great shape right now. Let's just put it that way. Unless you're selling a book about for or against Donald Trump, or about I don't know what, something else. The sort of it's a tough time to sell books, and so we'll see what happens. I'm hopeful, but we don't know.
Well, and I'm curious, and again, if other folks want to jump in, please do so. But before we let you go, one other question came up in my mind about when you were speaking about Painter in a Savage Land, and specifically Lemoyne de Morgue, and how he was, and this is kind of at the crux of it, right? He was the first European artist in in the New World, so to speak. And just because so much was going back to Europe about the new people that they were encountering, the natives, and so forth. And part of it's how he was, how the people, the natives of the Western world were portrayed. And so, previously it was in descriptions, written about, or words or whatever, but he gave probably the very first, actual visual representations of them. And I'm just really curious about, because I feel like that so much sets the tone or the trajectory of how these people would be conceived of, thousands of miles away in Europe. And, what we see in the way that we describe things with words can be, incredibly influential, right? So here's this person who has certainly a big impact for his time and in his place. And I'm just wondering, did you get the sense when you were writing it that, and I don't want to plant words here, but that it was part of, the way that ideas about the native people of North America, were conceived and developed, incubated, if you will, in the European mind of savages, of, people that, I just, because it just seems to me like this another way of, even though you're portraying them, you're also othering them.
Yeah, I think that the great sort of thing about this period. So this book takes place in 1564 and 1565. It's really a part of our deep past in this country. Although obviously the Native American past goes much, much deeper. And I think you're identified it exactly right. This is about how we, even with honest attempts, how hard it is to see, what we often call the other. So Lemoyne de Morgue wasn't the first artist to try to portray Native Americans, but I think he was the first artist to try to portray them in an accurate way. And so there, the early portrayals of them were, I mean, they're hilarious to our eyes. Some of them now, almost all is just cannibals. There's these great pictures where they've got like these butcher shops with, legs hanging up for, and a lot of these Native Americans, because Columbus was very influenced by classical literature and sort of what he expected to see. He said that a lot of Native Americans have the heads of dogs, and they were portrayed that way. And the Spanish had, they saw the Native Americans as someone to conquer and someone to convert. They painted them sometimes, but they weren't that interested in them. The French came over, and it was for equally cynical reasons. The French thought, well, we'll form some alliances with them. We'll do business with these people. And so this was all sort of corporate espionage. He was sent to describe Native Americans. It's what's interesting about him is just how badly we don't know his original paintings, because he had to literally get up and run when the Spanish attacked. I mean, his story of survival is incredible. So all we have is these prints that were supposedly based on his paintings, but he really, in those prints, he seems to fail to understand them. They're kind of shown as these they're very beautiful people. It's called mannerism. It's like these classical gods. And so even with this honest attempt to describe them, but the interesting thing about Lemoyne is he trained a later artist when he was in England, John White, who did a much better job of actually portraying not only Native Americans, but North American flora and fauna in a realistic way. And so I think that the lesson is, and we're again in this very divided time now, where sometimes I just look at people who aren't like me in all sorts of ways and think, oh, that person's that way, is the danger of not seeing the other person. And I think a lot of the tension we feel in the United States right now is by our inability to see each other as fully human. I increasingly hear on both sides of the political spectrum people dismissing the other as somehow not fully human, and that's such a dangerous way to go.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, where people look for the differences rather than the similarities. So,
Yep.
yeah. All right. Well, I want to just scan really quickly in case there are any other questions. But otherwise, I just wanted to say a big thank you for you giving us some time today, and making it work, even with your travel schedule. So
Oh,
really,
I'm honored and thrilled to be here, Tommy, and it's so great talking with you. And I again want to apologize for the sound quality and the picture quality. It's so great that we can talk via Zoom, and I'm glad that we were able to pull this off. But I'm sorry that there's a lot of noise and whatnot. And I so admire can I say this? I so admire what you and what the group are all about. I just think I was telling some people about it on Beaver Island yesterday, and just they were like, "That's such an amazingly cool model." And I'm not sure I represented the model correctly, but what I know of the model, and I just think what you all are doing is fantastic.
wow, thank you. Thank you so much. That's great. We really appreciate your time. And this is a part of what we do, because we know that, it keeps people engaged, and it's interesting, and we find common ground. And as Sue points out, that you were able to share things with us that we would have never heard of or thought about on our own. And I just want to say too, for our group here, I will post in the chat section and make available in a follow-up some links. So you can go to milesharvey.com, or I can send around some links for some links to your books in case anybody's interested. And then before we let you go, it looks like Tom Knutson wants to just chime in really quickly. So.
I've learned a lot from this. I've heard of stuff, a writer I've never known, and a book I need to read. But what I like, I used to be a newspaper reporter, and I really liked writing about confidence men.
Yeah.
And there is something, particularly in the character of Texans, that they are highly susceptible to big hats, big cigars, Cadillacs, Dallas hair, and fake jewelry. And you show up with that stuff, and you can kite your $10,000 to $20,000 in minutes in this state. It's amazing.
Yeah, Tom. It may be, there are con men all over the world, and
I know. There's one right now in Mar-a-Lago doing very well. Yeah.
Well, but it may be. There may be an American thing. I write about in the book. Charles Dickens came here in the early 1840s. And he was kind of shocked by the American propensity towards con men, and he was also what really surprised him and sort of alienated him was our propensity to like con men. Like he went to Cairo, Illinois, and there was a guy who had committed this massive land fraud scheme there, and the locals were like, "This guy's great," and he asked him why he's great, and he said he's a smart man. He's a smart man. And so and there was this emphasis that Dickens always said Americans love smart dealing, and he felt that was kind of an American thing. There may be something to that, but it sounds like what you're saying. This sort of brazen, in your face kind of, I'm going to rip you off and you're going to like it. I don't know what that is, but it may be. I'm sorry.
Okay, Jim Bowie's,
No.
our famous Alamo defender was actually a guy that fraudulently forged Spanish and French land grants to himself, and that was his source of wealth.
Yep.
Well, and I think we all know that, Stephen F. Austin was a big real estate developer in the politician's clothing. So, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. You can see them in all different places, but this one is absolutely fascinating. So,
just one more thing, Tommy. I mentioned in the book, initials you guys know down there, but this thing in the mid 19th century. When you were going to make a new start, like, so let's say you got yourself in trouble one place, you left on your door often GTT, gone to
To
Texas,
Texas.
which was like literally, some people were going to Texas to make a new star, but it was also kind of a euphemism for I'm flying by night. So it
Interesting.
may be, Tom, that enough people did the old GTT, and that's where they wound up, and the people
Yeah.
you're talking about are their descendants.
You know, my earliest memory of Texas besides drought was Billy Saul Estes. And a lot of you probably don't know who he was, but he sold empty fertilizer tanks.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, and what is the date that's a quote attributed to Davy Crockett that you may all go to hell and I will go to Texas. So.
Yep. And those guys were total contemporaries of Strang. Crockett, this idea of the self-made man. So yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it's fascinating. And I'm so glad that you spent some time with us this afternoon to share about it. And I will stay in touch with folks to give you all more information and links. But Miles, thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, it was an honor. And thank you, Tommy. It's always fun to talk to you, even via Zoom, especially via Zoom with your own group.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, we will let you go, and please give a big hug and kiss to Ringen for us, okay?
Yeah, right back at you guys. And thank you, everyone. Appreciate you spending a little bit of your Sunday afternoon with me.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.